Welcome, everyone. It is a joy and an honor to welcome you to Leah Baker's dissertation defense. I'd like to share a little bit about what the flow of this time together is going to be. So I will be introducing Leah's committee. I am her committee chair. I'll be introducing Dr. Becky Thompson, Dr. Sundari Johansson, and then turning it over to Leah for her presentation, which will be up to 50 minutes. Following her presentation, the committee will ask her 2 rounds of questions. And after that, there will be time for audience members to ask additional questions. The committee will go into a separate room briefly to discuss the defense, and then we'll come back with an announcement about our feedback on the defense. So I would like to start by introducing Leah's external committee member, Dr. Becky Thompson. And let me pull up. So Becky Thompson is a poet, scholar, yogi, and activist. Her books include Poetry to Speak in Salt, a book called Making Mirrors, Writing, both spellings of the word writing, By and for Refugees, Teaching with Tenderness, which is on feminist pedagogy, which we use in our program, Survivors on the Yoga Mat, Zero is the Hole I Fall Into at Night, and A Promise and a Way of Life, White Anti-Racist Activism, as well as other books. Her honors include fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, the NEH, the AAUW, the Creative Justice Poetry Prize, and the Gustavus Myers Award for Outstanding Books and Human Rights. She has held appointments at China Women's University, Princeton, Duke, the University of Colorado, and currently at Simmons University. Becky, would you like to unmute yourself for a moment to say hi and anything you want to add to that?
Hi, everybody. Hi, I'm going to have to keep muted because there's this huge construction site going on right next to me for like a year and a half. So just so you know, that's why. But really, I'm here to shine light your direction.
Thanks, Becky. And Leah's internal committee member, by internal we mean internal to CIS, is Dr. Sundari Johansson, who specializes in gender, the body, ritual, power, and secrecy in religion. While her interest in these themes encompasses a variety of religious traditions, her research work currently focuses on ritual studies in South Asia, especially Hinduism, Shaktism, which is goddess-focused Hindu traditions, and Tantra in India. She's done quite extensive work in the field of Hindu and Tantric studies, but for the purposes of her support of Leah's work, I want to emphasize that her work is deeply rooted in post-colonial and decolonial transnational feminist and integrative philosophies, as well as exploration of non-Western philosophical and theoretical traditions. Dr. Johansson is a strong proponent of integral feminist pedagogies and research methods, and is interested in furthering the development of immersive, cooperative, and collaborative educational models in online education. Would you like to say hello and add anything to that, Sundari?
No, I think that's about it. But I just want to again, just add to the happy to be here and happy to be to see Leah's defense and to I think the word shine a light is are good ones.
Thanks, Sundari. And I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm a professor in the Women's Spirituality program, and I've been at CIS since 2011. My areas of research and teaching are around feminist spiritual activism, transformative leadership and pedagogy, decolonial animal ethics, as well as integral epistemologies. And I want to really emphasize the pedagogy piece because that is what Leah's dissertation is about and what how we've come to work together so closely. And even though my work has been primarily on higher education, through working with Leah, I've come to better understand how integral feminist pedagogies also applies to K-12 education. So I will briefly introduce Leah's project and then turn it over to Leah. So Leah Baker's dissertation has the wonderful title, Leading with Love, Reimagining Support Systems for Educators Implementing Instructional Equity. She begins with the recognition that educator activists who champion social change within inequitable systems are struggling with burnout as they push against inadequate institutional support. So as she goes through this defense, she will be talking about what she found by interviewing teachers who've experienced burnout. And she comes to emphasize that teacher burnout should be understood as systemic exploitation. And her study critiques a culture of glorified teacher self-sacrifice and martyrdom. And I also just want to acknowledge that in the room with us today is our department co-chairs, Dr. Annette Williams and Dr. Anna Corwin, if you wanted to say hello, and V. Krasnich, our program coordinator. Thank you so much for organizing this. And with that, I will turn it over to Leah.
Thank you for all of the introductions and setting the tone. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the slides right now. Awesome. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody who is here today. And I especially want to thank Dr. Aurora and Dr. Thompson and Dr. Johansson, who spent so much of their time guiding me through this process. This is an important milestone, and my cats might come into the screen. Sorry. This is an important milestone that I'm really excited to share and to put out into the world. And most of all, I really want to thank the teachers that volunteered to be part of this study and whose courage and love and dedication to the profession of teaching is marked here. I'm really grateful for all the humor and joy and heart that they shared with me during the process. So this is dedicated to them. This is our agenda for today. It just follows a CIAS format, which most of you are probably already familiar with, but in case you're not, this is what you can expect to hear and see today. When I first began this research, Dr. Aurora and I kept coming back to this quote. A good teacher is like a candle that consumes itself while lighting the way for others. Part of this quote is okay. I think a lot of teachers want to light the way for their students, but consume themselves, not so much. At the time when I started my research, a framed copy of this quote was sitting in my school's copy room. And the quote made a terrible reappearance again this last year when on Teacher Appreciation Day, a teacher in my district shared that their principal had gifted all of the teachers wooden coasters with this quote engraved on it. And when they posted it, another teacher replied, "I would use a candle to set this gift on fire." I'm not sure that this framed photo or this drink coaster sends the right message to teachers with its grim message of literal self-sacrifice. The pressures and demands of teaching can take a profound toll on the physical, emotional, and mental well-being of teachers. And teacher burnout is a reality about which much research has been done. I'm an educator myself. I'm in my 19th year of working in public schools. And 2 years ago, I left my position as a classroom teacher I now serve supporting brand new teachers who are just starting out in my school district. And when people ask me why I left the classroom, I usually just say burnout, but I don't think that adequately captures the reality that I experienced. So as a teacher, I cared deeply about social justice and addressing deep systemic issues through my work with students. And I considered myself an educator activist. But the limitations of the school institutions that I worked in and the lack of support that I received in my efforts often left me feeling isolated and drained and demoralized. Little to no research has been done about educator activists who work to implement the important work of instructional equity and social justice in schools and its impact on teacher burnout. When I say instructional equity, I mean this definition. So instructional equity addresses educational access gaps caused by systemic oppression that affect students' academic outcomes. And these are based on race, gender, ability, socioeconomic status, and more. Teachers who do this work do so with heart, and they have a desire to transform education and advance liberation. So that's what I wanted to research. My research uses a feminist narrative lens to explore the impact of teacher burnout on educator activists. And the goal of my research was to establish more supportive and sustainable teaching environments for teachers. I interviewed 10 K-12 public school educators to better understand their recommendations for sustaining teachers who implement equity-based instruction. And along the way, this research has really helped me unpack my own understanding of my burnout within a larger context. My research questions were, how do teachers' efforts to implement instructional equity intersect with teacher burnout? What are teachers currently doing to counteract burnout? And what do teachers say they need from their institutions to feel supported and prevent burnout? The following key terms were employed throughout this study. Compassion fatigue is where a person experiences stress as a result of caring for others. It's one of the costs of caring. The original meaning of emotional labor when it was first coined is when somebody must check their own feelings in order to offer service with a smile as part of their job. Teachers are expected to do this kind of emotional labor, and emotional labor, we know from the research, often goes unnoticed and unrewarded, and it can be particularly taxing for women and other historically underserved people who might be expected to perform this work without adequate recognition or compensation. Feminist pedagogies work to counteract how institutions like schools can perpetuate the injustices of society. And although aspects of feminist pedagogies are present in a lot of public school classrooms, in my experience, explicit references to feminism are largely absent. So feminist classrooms might do things like centering students' voices and uplifting their knowledge, having books that are outside of the white male canon, promoting active dialogue, and encouraging critical thinking. Instructional equity was already defined on a previous slide, but I wanted to add that Zaretta Hammond distinguishes 3 different threads of equity. So those are multicultural education, social justice education, and culturally responsive education. And then last is teacher burnout. This is a process that can happen gradually for educators or right away. And it's an experience in which feelings of cynicism or exhaustion or disillusionment replace the sense of energy or hope they had at the start of their career. I included 190 works in my literature review, and I found a ton of literature that addressed the need for US schools to better implement equity-based instruction. For example, June Jordan says that the US public school system fails the new American majority, which is composed of folks who are neither white nor speak English as a first language. Equity-based instruction has had an interesting evolution since its inception, and I explored its timeline in the literature review. In the 60s, we saw Paulo Freire's publishing of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We saw women's studies and African American studies programs in US universities in the 60s that furthered the work of equity-minded curricula. But we also know that dialogue about these issues didn't begin in academic settings. So it began in community centers, in people's homes, in the streets, and in political meetings. In public K-12 schools, we saw the popular emergence of multicultural education and colorblind mentalities. But as Kimberly Crenshaw says, trying to close racial equity gaps without mentioning race is like asking for directions without being allowed to name the destination. Goldie Mohammed talks about the inadequacy of adding a multicultural book or two to a curriculum, saying that schools must also work to consciously promote anti-racist and liberatory efforts. We also need to look at policies and practices in the larger scope of educational institutions outside of just lesson plans. So these include discipline policies, grading practices, attendance policies, and a ton of other things. Implementing feminist pedagogies is complex work, and it's made more difficult by public and political opposition to it. So some people see social justice education as political indoctrination, particularly in Republican-leaning states. So for example, between 2021 and 22, proposed curriculum censorship bills surged by 250%. 54 bills aimed to ban critical race theory, calling it divisive. And there's also been a rise in anti-LGBTQ plus policies in schools, like what's dubbed Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. In my own district, which is in a largely liberal West Coast city, we've also experienced numerous examples of political opposition as well. Including just this year, there were new district mandates which limit classroom displays reflecting teachers' personal and political beliefs. The pattern I noticed in the literature is that there's a catch-22 with society's expectations of teachers. The public wants educators to teach caring values, but kind of only when those caring values support the lives of students belonging to dominant groups. Teachers face immense scrutiny because they're expected to transform the world and humanize students, but at the same time, they are silenced on crucial social issues. Today, around 34% of school districts in the United States report in their mission statements that they strive for equity. And the number is larger in Democratic-leaning states. So that number in those states is 56%. But even if a school's commitment to equity is strong, the translation of theory to practice can be difficult to achieve due to schools' underestimation of the systemic changes that need to take place in order to support the educators that are doing this work at the front lines. Sometimes they can be siloed or unsupported in their efforts to do so. And so from my personal experience, I knew that more research needed to be done about how to support those teachers in their work. There's some research on activist burnout, and it shows how activists can sometimes feel the pressure to be superhuman, which is also common for classroom teachers. But there's very little research that shows the overlap of activism and activism in teaching and the burnout that happens there. Also, for educators of historically underserved groups who are not only implementing equity models in their classrooms, but also experiencing firsthand issues of equity in their daily lives, the pressure can be even heavier. And I wanted to explore this gap in the literature. Current solutions for teacher burnout center largely on self-care. And I wanted to explore the larger systemic exploitation of teachers and the failure of self-care to adequately combat this. I wanted to look also at the broader societal undervaluation of work that is female dominated, with 76% of teachers being female, and the expectation for women to provide the emotional aspects of care work. The methodology I used for this dissertation was feminist narrative research with a qualitative interview-based approach. Feminist narrative research aims to understand and improve the lives of the people that are telling their stories for the research. It prioritizes the voices and experiences of the individuals being interviewed, especially women, and it subverts the prevailing epistemic paradigm that knowledge is hierarchical. Because teaching is a female-dominated field, it's very possible that the experiences, expertise, and voiced needs of teachers have been downplayed or ignored, which is why in this research, I really wanted to uplift the voices of teachers. I frequently cited their words in extended quotes in the research, and I intentionally incorporated their voices into my analysis. For my interviews, I used a hybrid model of in-person and Zoom interviews. Both options allowed me to observe participants' facial expressions and their body language. And in-person meetings also offered me a better understanding of contextual information, particularly if we met in participants' homes. But providing both options allowed me to be flexible with participants' preferences, given their geographic location or their time constraints or their comfort level. My interview questions were pre-planned, but I used a semi-structured format so that I could adjust my questions and follow the organic flow of the interviews. This was really useful because I was asking my participants to tell their stories, and sometimes they would answer a question before I had a chance to ask it. And I also wanted to allow their story to guide the process rather than interrupting the flow. As an insider researcher who still works in education, I found that my shared experience with participants, even if I did not know them beforehand, helped me to encourage them to be more open about sharing personal details. To analyze the interviews, I used the voice-centered relational method. I listened to the interview material repeatedly. First, I would listen through my own lens, and I recorded all of my initial reactions in process notes. Next, I listened for I statements in order to better understand how the participants saw themselves. Last, I listened for themes, and then I sorted the analysis by theme. And overall, I felt like this sequential approach helped me center participants' voices before I labeled and categorized their responses. I recruited 13 K-12 public school educators with the hope of having 10 have the time to complete the interviews. I wanted to limit my numbers to this small range so that I could have a deeper analysis of people's stories. The following was my inclusion criteria that I used for recruiting participants. I reached out first to former and current colleagues that I had worked with, and then those folks recommended other people using the snowball effect. I also advertised the study on social media platforms, and I additionally reached out to students here at CIAS using the email listserv. Because the demographic composition of educators in the US is largely female, so 76%, and white, 79%, I prioritized recruiting at least 70% female teachers. And in the end, 80% of my participants were female. I also wanted to uplift the voices, experiences, and perspectives of educators of color, and I wanted a minimum representation of 40%. In the end, 50% of the participants were educators of color. And while this is a larger percentage than is currently represented in teaching, I felt like a representation of less than 5 might risk merely tokenizing historically underrepresented educators, which I did not want. My aim instead was to better amplify their voices. So I felt that 50% was appropriate. This table indicates the self-identified backgrounds of the interviewed teachers. Some of the names on this table are their pseudonyms, which I allowed participants to choose if they wanted to. After conducting the interviews, I implemented 2 separate member checks. The first was to allow participants to review the written transcripts of the recorded interviews. And in the second, participants were all given a copy of my written analysis, and they were asked to review and provide feedback. I felt that this gave participants an ongoing voice in the process. If I was to describe the tenor of the interviews, I would share that the participants were mostly funny. I felt that they were real, they were humorous, and they were also driven by a tremendous amount of heart. There was always a balance between their humor and the deep dedication they showed for their students. And I felt that their stories and their reflections were very nuanced and really helped illustrate the complexities of education today. This next section details the findings of the research, and I wanted to include a lot of participant quotes. So instead of having my voice take over and read the quotes for you, I'm going to pause to allow the teacher's words to speak for themselves rather than reading them out loud. At the center of the narratives in this study, I uncovered a resounding theme of care. These teachers care a lot. They give a lot. And through the interviews, I saw how equity-minded teachers prioritize not only students' academic success, but also their well-being. And I also saw in the research how these teachers play the role of activists, advocating for their students on a daily basis and advocating for more inclusive practices to dismantle barriers to learning. The care that teachers give can lead to role overload, and with that, a propensity for burnout. Here are just a few reflections on how burnout surfaces for teachers. As you can see from just this small sampling, burnout has a significant impact on equity-minded teachers. All 10 of the teachers that I interviewed described that they had experienced some level of burnout in their career, but all of them still show dedication and devotion to their work, which indicates a culture of martyrdom and self-sacrifice in teaching. The categories of burnout that emerged in this study by theme are listed here on the left. And while the activism of equity-based instruction aims to have a positive impact on students, it often comes at a high cost to teachers. These teachers described facing challenges like emotional overload, secondary traumatic stress when exposed to students' personal hardships on a daily basis, or primary trauma from exposure to student violence. So this includes things like school shootings or the threat of school shootings. Teachers also face time constraints, insufficient pay, and systemic undervaluation, particularly in a female-dominated profession. Some of the teachers in this study reported specific gendered expectations that they felt of women to freely provide care work. This stress is particularly compounded for the educators in this study who belong to historically marginalized groups. So these teachers told stories of facing additional hurdles, including racial trauma and homophobia, And they described experiencing the compounded effects of systemic oppression on top of serving in a dual role as an activist for, as well as members of the groups that they advocate for. And this aligns with the literature. Resmaa Menakem talks about how these types of negative experiences can compound within the human body and create a corrosive effect. Participants also describe tensions with colleagues who misunderstand or resist equity efforts, or colleagues who create a hostile work environment by putting their own racism or homophobia on display. On the right-hand side, these are the burnout symptoms that teachers reported experiencing. So some teachers spoke of experiencing a profound internal conflict between their love and their dedication to their students and their desire to leave the profession. The physical health issues and mental health challenges that teachers reported, including those that were exacerbated by existing conditions, show the toll that the dedication to instructional equity can take on teachers. And some of them describe this strain extending into their personal and family lives, affecting their relationships, and causing feelings of guilt and frustration. Last, there was one teacher that now experiences less significant burnout in recent years, but only because he has siloed himself and disassociated from the school system in a way that allows him to survive within it. The following words of participants illustrate some of the feelings expressed when they described their burnout symptoms. Although these teachers spoke of burnout in a bleak way, none of them actually showed signs of actually planning to resign. But the burnout symptoms that they detailed were troubling. Sounds like they could just take a nice bubble bath or get a teacher discount and feel better, right? Much of the current literature suggests that self-care is the solution to these issues, but this study reveals that while self-care is important for teachers and can help them survive, we don't want them to survive, we want them to thrive. So self-care simply isn't enough. Self-care places the responsibility for these symptoms on individual teachers rather than acknowledging the systemic conditions that cause them. Reframing burnout as exploitation can help shift the conversation away from personal responsibility and address instead the systemic changes and collective care that's needed in order to address the root causes of burnout. So let's talk about self-care in a caregiving profession. The literature shows that women are expected to perform caregiving roles with little or no concern for their well-being. And feminists and care theorists reevaluate this expectation, and they advocate for a better balance between caregiving and self-care. Carolyn Picker, for example, asks us to consider the contradiction of the notion of self-care, as we have both been taught to martyr ourselves as caregivers and also prioritize our own comfort, which is a phenomenon that happens at the intersection of misogyny and white supremacy. These sentiments are mirrored in the interviews, where a few teachers candidly or sarcastically dismissed school districts' efforts towards encouraging self-care as superficial or ineffective. Here are their words. As you can see from these participant quotes, despite engaging in various self-care activities themselves, they expressed skepticism about its efficacy and its over-commercialization. Instead, they attributed burnout repercussions to systemic issues rather than personal responsibility. Still, this research did aim to detail the wide-ranging self-care strategies that they currently use to navigate the demands of teaching. So while these might be insufficient to prevent symptoms and burnout entirely, they can still help while larger systemic changes are still taking root. Like Tricia Hersey says in her book, Rest is Resistance, self-care can be both a form of protest and personal reclamation. The following table outlines a list of the self-care and community care approaches that teachers said they practiced in this study. These methods extended beyond stereotyped practices like bubble baths, including the strategy of incorporating humor, sarcasm, and cursing to cope with the challenges of teaching. Alone time, work-life balance, physical activity, and therapy also emerged, highlighting the need for boundaries and mental health support. Faith and spiritual practices also play a significant role for some teachers and offer strength and peace. Some folks are still developing their self-care. So one teacher's narrative, for example, she said she was still in the baby stages of learning self-care after 17 years of teaching. And this shows the need for understanding teachers' difficulties in finding space and time to prioritize their well-being amidst the demands of teaching. However, while self-care is essential, it's still individualized and isolating. Dory Midnight writes that what we need to end, and by end I mean transform, is the privatization of healing, the illusion that our struggles are private and separate. In the right-hand column are the acts of community care that teachers shared and said that they engage in. Shared physical spaces and thriving collegial relationships provide emotional and professional support. Interviewees emphasized their need to nurture relationships outside of school with family and friends and engage in communal activities which bring joy and relaxation, such as sharing food with others. Teachers also expressed the need for gestures of external recognition and appreciation from their communities. Subversiveness was another key strategy. And by subversiveness, I mean when teachers bend strict professional policies and working hours in order to meet their human needs. So for example, taking students outside, even when they've been told not to, planning weddings or baby showers with colleagues during work hours. These illustrate acts of solidarity, mutual aid, and community care. And they show how teachers can prioritize human needs over bureaucratic policies. Despite what teachers shared about self-care, they also described systemic challenges that sometimes prevent their ability to prioritize self-care, even when systems are telling them to prioritize their self-care. So for example, teachers shared stories of not being able to find a sub to miss work to go to their therapist or doctor, or being told they can't miss staff meetings in order to pick up their children after school. This reveals a gap between stated institutional values and their implementation. The final part of this research was to hear recommendations from the teachers themselves. So hearing their voices tell us what they need in order to feel more supported and prevent burnout. I asked them to be imaginative about what they felt their schools could look like in order to make the efforts toward instructional equity feel more sustainable. Mariam Kaba says, let's begin our abolitionist journey not with the question, what do we have now and how can we make it better? Instead, let's ask, what can we imagine for ourselves and the world? If we do that, then boundless possibilities of a more just world await us. If we only try to make what we have now better, it's possible that it may be the equivalent of trying to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. The following quotes from participants illustrate some of the attitudes that surfaced during the interviews, reflecting the necessity of these changes. Here are their words. As you can see from these teacher quotes, change is necessary. Imagination is a vital practice if we want to enact change. Teachers criticized their school's equity-focused mission statements, saying that their institutions merely pay lip service to equity. And these teachers desperately want their schools to actually enact measures of care for students and for their teachers. This would better ensure a reciprocal commitment to equity. The following table categorizes the recommended changes and types of support the teachers in this study imagined. I broke these down into 3 categories by theme. The first is teacher-focused support. Teachers said, first and foremost, they need more planning time so that they have the time to create more inclusive practices and curricula that meets students' unique needs. So for example, having more time to find resources that reflect the different languages that might be in their classrooms. They suggested extended planning periods or restructuring the school week entirely in order to create more time for dedicated student support and teacher prep. They also imagined a work schedule where flexible time off policies and personal care time are embedded. Some of the teachers reiterated commonly heard union demands. So those are things like smaller class sizes and fairer compensation for teachers to show that they're more valued. For school-focused support, teachers emphasized a need for more meaningful professional development around equity-based learning. And they recommended specific things such as allowing it to be led by fellow educators rather than out-of-touch administrators, or having it be done in affinity groups. Teachers also shared their concerns about standardized testing and its known cultural bias, and the need for more equitable assessment methods and better ways of measuring whether schools are reaching their equity goals. They also talked about the importance of addressing health and safety issues in school buildings. They expressed needs for more support staff, such as counselors, advocates, and paraeducators. Teachers also said they want more genuine administrative support. They criticized superficial efforts from administrators to show care. And they also called for a balance between more autonomy and more supportive oversight from administrators. So things like better mentorship, constructive feedback, and at the same time, more freedom to address socially relevant topics. Teachers also want to feel more empowered, with teachers and student voices better uplifted in collaborative decision-making processes. They also want increased system-wide consistency about what equity-based instruction looks like. Teachers also suggested implementing better policies to confront discriminatory behaviors amongst staff and students. Last was community-focused support. For this, teachers emphasized how strengthening relationships and camaraderie amongst staff is critical. They shared a vision of increased community engagement to recognize that societal challenges shouldn't fall solely on teachers' shoulders to fix. This could look like schools forming partnerships with local businesses and nonprofits. It could look like collaborating with local healthcare facilities in order to support student health and well-being, and better funding after-school programs to strengthen community ties and support students' interests. Last, teachers want to challenge the unrealistic societal expectations of them. Overall, they advocated for redefining the teacher archetype to prioritize teachers' well-being rather than emphasizing teacher self-sacrifice. If we can reimagine how society views teaching, we can move away from seeing educators as martyrs and seeing them instead as human beings. Audre Lorde reminded us that without community, there is no liberation. And this study brings to light how educator activists have created communities of equity in their classrooms And yet, at the same time, how school communities and society have not yet replicated this same care back towards its teachers. This paradox highlights a critical need for a more supportive and equitable outlook for teachers. We need to support not just students, but also their educators who advocate for justice. To truly support equity efforts, schools need to adopt, align, and amplify the principles of justice and care that these principles practice in their classrooms. And this would better ensure that the entire educational environment supports and sustains the teachers who are at the front lines of this work. This study makes these recommendations for educational institutions so that they can take proactive steps to support their teachers. This would include, first of all, a collaborative imagining process. This could take place between teachers and administrators or teachers in their school districts. And it could be done through efforts like listening surveys that would allow teachers to be better heard. Districts could then draw from teachers' collective creativity to create support systems that are tailored to address the specific schools in that area. Second is efforts to create stronger community care models, which could help alleviate the individual burden of care that teachers are shouldering. Neighborhoods and communities could work toward fostering a culture of more shared support, where teachers and students feel nurtured. Communities themselves need to work to re-envision teachers as full human beings rather than symbols of unending service. Last would be aligning policies with equity goals. This would include school districts working to provide support measures recommended by teachers in this study, as well as implementing relevant site-based changes suggested by educators in the process described in number 1. Jackie Alexander invites teachers to embark on a transformative journey that will require a great demand on imagination. She calls for the creation of a new conceptual map. The teachers in this study have demonstrated vital imaginative pedagogies and have shown in detail what creative equity-based models can look like in practice. This study suggests the need for imagining new possibilities, which can be a generative and a communal creative process. Institutions need to move beyond nominally using the rhetoric of equity in their mission statements and more actively work to reimagine and embody these principles in their policies and practices so that the educators who champion justice are uplifted and sustained. So, what's new about this research? First, this study adds insights to the existing literature by examining the intersections of activist burnout, teacher burnout, and the implementation of equity-based instruction. The narrative analysis details how equity-minded teachers strive to implement a culture of care, and it also details the emotional toll and systemic barriers that these educators face. It offers a nuanced understanding of burnout in this context. Second, by applying feminist principles, this study examines the gendered nature of teaching and caregiving, emphasizing the need for systemic reform rather than relying solely on self-care to address inequalities. The intersection of societal expectations and the devaluation of women's work is a key factor here. We know from the literature that within caregiving roles, women are often not viewed as professionals, but as women. And this mindset keeps them in low-paying positions, and it reproduces patriarchal structures in the development of capitalism. Last, this study offers insights on the need for a shift in the unrealistic expectations we hold of teachers. This is maybe the most challenging recommendation to address and implement, and more activism, advocacy, and continued open dialogue is needed for promoting a more realistic view of teaching. By challenging traditional gender roles and stereotypes, we can work to create a more equitable perspective that values teaching and care work just as highly as other professions. A new archetype of teacher is needed. one that moves beyond martyrdom and is rooted in a post-patriarchal framework where teachers are valued as full human beings rather than just symbols of sacrifice. The romanticized notion that a good teacher is like a candle that consumes itself while lighting the way for others glorifies self-sacrifice. And it unfortunately perpetuates the unsustainable expectation that teachers must literally burn themselves out. Implementing more equitable practices in education should not depend on teachers' willingness to consume themselves or rely on coping mechanisms to survive. Instead, this research calls for a radical reform of educational systems and societal attitudes that undervalue the work of teachers. True equity in education requires systemic support, resources, and policies that empower teachers rather than expecting them to bear the burden of much needed societal change through personal sacrifice. By shifting away from this outdated candle metaphor and embracing imagination, community care, liberation, and mutual aid, we can work together towards better supporting teachers in a manner that fans their flame, allowing them to illuminate the way for others without burning out. This concludes this segment of the defense. I really appreciate all of you for listening. At this point, I would love to suggest a really quick bathroom break and advocate for one for myself. This is a discovery I accidentally made in my research. One teacher joked that she said, in teaching, there's no bathroom breaks, but I like the idea that somewhere out there in the universe, there's a break waiting for me. And it took me till interview number 9 to actually take a break for myself. So after the 5-minute bathroom break, let's do questions and comments and have further discussion if that's okay.
That's a great idea, Leah. So thank you for that. Beautiful conclusion. I really enjoyed your presentation. So we'll come back in 5 minutes. So just a couple minutes past the hour to start the round of questions from the committee.
Great, thank you.
So for when Sundari is back, I think we still have a minute or two before we're at 5 minutes. So. Right. Okay, welcome back. Leah, I once again want to acknowledge that was such a clear and compelling presentation. Thank you, and hope you're able to exhale, but not completely because you still have questions that we have to ask. So I would like to invite either Sundari or Becky, whoever has we're going to do 2 rounds. So we'll each ask a question and then we'll do a second round. So rather than asking both of your questions one after the other, hold your second question for the second round. So Becky, Sundari, whoever, Sundari, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to echo the so great the clarity of your presentation. You really presented your data very clearly and effectively, I think. It seems like there's a really so a lot of my questions are all sort of like, what happens after this, right? Because because you identify as a activist educator, right? And it seems like there's a really good opportunity here for public scholarship. And so what I want to know is how you plan to bring this to the public. Like what are your plans for making this available to teachers and districts and putting it into a form that is useful?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think a lot, or I did think a lot during this process about what would create the greatest impact and be the most successful thing. So, I just watched my own school district last year go on strike for almost a month with some of the demands that were referenced in the teacher recommendations section. So, smaller class sizes and more pay, and the strike didn't get us very far, as we know. That often happens for public school educators. So, I kept thinking about, what makes a huge impact. And what I saw from the interviews, there was a couple of interviewees that described things that did make a huge impact and could be communicated to school district leadership as things that are impactful, and would really help move this work forward in a way that doesn't require much more resources or money or restructuring of contracts, et cetera. One of those, for example, was a teacher who shared that a superintendent that she had really had an ethics of care and equity in her approach to influencing the teachers in their district. So they really took time to engage in what's called courageous conversations and have professional development around what those can look like tangibly in classrooms. And what that educator shared with me is that superintendent really modeled it themselves in the way that they showed up to everything. And I thought, wow, like that doesn't take a lot of resources. So as we move this work forward, how can we, help administrators and school leadership know that it can kind of start from there? It can kind of start from that modeling stance. And, I did find some literature that reflected, that kind of strong positive leadership model. Elizabeth Lee Feltz, in her research, she's an educational administrator, and she talks about how she exemplifies what a supportive equity-based leader can look like and how they can operate. So she really incorporates that feminist ethics of care into her leadership approach and emphasizes listening, mentoring in her leadership instead of managing. And so I think if we, can continue to get this message out there to school leaders, that can make maybe the highest impact in the smallest amount of time.
Thank you, Sundari and Leah. Becky, would you like to ask a question?
One is an observation about the changes in the title of your dissertation from the beginning to the end, and how that, I think, reflects your own theoretical innovations. But my question is about an example of the high in the research and the low in this journey for you.
Do you mean in my own
Yeah.
process?
As a researcher and as an activist.
Yeah. For me, the high, and I had kind of read about this when I was doing my methodologies exam, but it was really this understanding of how the research itself could lend itself to, how the process itself could lend itself to relational care. Mm-hmm. And I felt that in the interviews. Like I felt my life experience and my frustrations and my difficulties being reflected back to me, sometimes from people that I knew, sometimes from complete strangers. Mm-hmm. And some of them reflected that back to me as well. So after the interviews, sometimes somebody would say something back to me like, wow, it was really nice being heard. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, oh, like that's what I wanted this to do, was to like help, people feel heard. And I felt heard, I felt seen, even though it wasn't my intention for me to be seen. It felt like such a healing process. And I afterwards read this other study that was like an accidental result in their research, was that they found that the educators who were part of their research study experienced, accidental community care as a part of being included in a discussion. So I thought, well, other research studies are seeing this, like, this is really something, how can we make research itself a healing process? That was a high for me. A low for me was, I really found it difficult. Do I sound like a robot right now? Is that just my computer?
You okay?
Okay. A low for me was, one thing that really surprised me was, it was really, teachers did not have time to do these interviews. And so and that is absolutely reflective of everything that I learned from them in the process, is that, like, they want to give, they want to, like, have more time for things. They want to, participate in the research, but it was really challenging to find time to sit with people and really dedicate and give that space that I wanted to give to the interviews themselves. So it both taught me something about the realities that teachers are facing. And it was also just really challenging. Like, I thought, oh my God, I'm never gonna, these teachers want to participate, but, like, we're never gonna do the interview. And I got kind of stressed about it. So we did complete them all, and everybody made time, but it was just sort of disheartening to see, like, oh, dedicating 2 hours is, like, really a lot to ask from somebody. And especially when I'm trying to hold, a sense of care for the reality of that they face of having limited time anyway. Thanks for that question.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks for answering, Leah. So, is that me?
I don't know who it is.
No, it's when people are unmuted, then there is a little bit of echo. I'll pay closer attention to that.
Oh, okay. So my question, Leah, my first question is about sort of a range of responses in terms of, like, did you see differences with teachers who were in better resourced schools versus less resourced schools, or were all the schools that the teachers you interviewed at more similar in terms of, the economics of the school district and that? And then related to that, I mean, not, kind of auxiliary to that, is also things that you saw in terms of the teachers who were more marginalized in terms of their own identities by race or class, and just kind of more about the differences you saw in your range.
Yeah, definitely. That's an excellent question. Yes, there was quite a range. I felt there was one teacher story that's kind of standing out in my head in particular, because she is a teacher who moved from a Title I school to a more resourced school. So she herself kind of experienced that narrative arc and explained it in her narrative. And she is an educator of color, and she expressed that she felt an enormous amount of guilt having, this soft landing pad after having had years of feeling like unsupported and under-resourced in this school that she was teaching in, to then move to a more resourced, largely white school and actually experience a sense of relief in, oh, my school supports me now. Oh, my school can fund my journalism project now. So it was sort of a paradox for her in that she felt some relief, but also understood the implications of that reality that she was living. And I think that remains pretty hard for her. You also asked about, can you say the second question again?
Well, sort of around the, what differences did you see among your participants who were, say, of color or otherwise marginalized versus the more dominant group? participants.
Yeah, thank you. So the educators belonging to historically underserved groups explained additional examples of feeling frustrated by their peers, or experiencing homophobia and racism in the schools themselves. So, for example, one participant's story that's kind of standing out to me right now is that she was really excited to see that her school was offering a training on equity, and she really wanted to attend, and she was so excited about it. And when she went, it wasn't done in affinity groups, and she witnessed her white peers going, "Oh, I never learned this before. I've never even heard of redlining. Oh my gosh, I'm such a shocked white person to discover like discrimination exists." And she said that that was the first time in her career that she had experienced racial trauma. And it's really disheartening because it was in the school district's attempt to provide this equity training to people that, they just completely lost the plot and did it in a way that actually harmed an educator of color. So some of those experiences and stories that folks described were incredibly disheartening. And the pattern that I saw was that it was a school district offering something or saying that they were offering something and then kind of like messing it up. Another example was one of my other teachers that I interviewed. Her school district started offering stipends for multilingual educators. So if you're multilingual and you're bringing that to your classroom, maybe you're a DLI teacher, you can get a stipend. And that's great in theory. But she saw the folks around her having to really fight HR to receive that stipend, like really having to beg for it, basically. And that's, just an insult. And that's traumatizing to have it dangled in front of you and then just, make them fight so hard and scramble so hard to get it is just, yeah, some of those stories were really hard.
Wow, those are really great examples, Leah, especially the one where you said the educator of color who moved schools. That's very, it's compelling, right? Because this attempt at a way, it was her self-care to move schools, and yet there's like this guilt and all that comes with it. So thank you. Sundari, do you have a second question?
Yeah, I have a comment, a little bit of feedback about your presentation, which was that, and this kind of leads into my question, which was that I noticed that you made a choice not to read the words of your participants, which I think presents an accessibility issue, right, for the presentation, for folks who may be visually impaired, watching this later, not being able to interact with those words, right? And so this kind of leads into something else I was thinking about with your research. You had at least one, I know that there was at least one, there might have been more educators who identified as, having ADHD, being neurodivergent, maybe having other disabilities. And I'm wondering how sort of that, how that impacted their, how that impacts educators' experiences. And, obviously with additional intersections of race and class and all of these things, and how, that piece, yeah, I just want to hear more about that piece.
Yeah, thank you for pointing out that the presentation itself presented potentially difficulties for accessibility. It's always, I think, it can be difficult to hear like, oh, I tried and then I failed. But I think that's what, this work is about, is just, understanding that listening for that feedback is important if we really care to make the changes that we're suggesting. So yeah, I'm thinking about one educator in particular. I mentioned that some of the educators I interviewed had existing mental health issues that they talked about, and just overwhelmingly felt under-supported by their administrators in addressing those issues. And so it raises questions about, okay, then what are we doing? Like, if we say we're an equity-based school, what are we doing? And that was the educator who, I mentioned that it was, they needed to be able to make doctor's appointments and therapy appointments, but then, part of their story is that they've been just repeatedly told by their administrators, like, you can't take this time off. So what do we do, if we're saying do self-care and we support equity, but then we're not allowing people that additional space to make those appointments, which we know it's like impossible to get an appointment. Or there was another story, there was an educator who, she, very young person, found out she had high blood pressure, and that high blood pressure, they like put a device on her. Her doctors tracked her blood pressure throughout the week, and the blood pressure was spiking during staff meetings. And she shared that with her administrators, and they were like, you can't miss staff meetings, so just absolutely no room for accommodations, which is interesting because we, with 504s and IEPs, like with students, we really, try so hard to make accommodations when they are expressed. So the question remains, why are we not giving those same accommodations to our educators? Why?
Where's the IEPs for teachers?
Yeah. Where are they?
Yeah.
And why say no? No, like, how hard is it to, say, okay, doctor's note, like, don't come to the staff meeting. I will give you the slides, or we can give you a recording. Like, if somebody came to me after this meeting and was like, can, you read those teachers' words out loud for me because I'm visually impaired, I would just be like, yes. Like, is it that hard?
And I want to just make one small possible recommendation, which is that in your, if you end up continuing this work, doing more interviews, expanding on it, and even you can even go back to your research participants. If you get, you could get written permission to actually use their voices so that you can use clips. And then, if they want to be anonymized, you can, anonymize their voices. You can use actors. There's a lot of ways to bridge that gap. So just want to always recommend when you're doing research like this to get permission, to think in advance of how you might want to use those recordings, to be able to use them in, situations like this.
I love that idea. That would be so powerful. Thank you.
Great discussion. Becky, do you have a second question?
Sure. What I saw you do is reframe so many of the normative ways that things are written about, and I'm thinking most about reframing burnout to exploitation. And although in your title, the title would suggest someone that's come out of I don't know, the teaching with tenderness like camp, you actually have a Marxist analysis all the way through the dissertation as well with your understanding of class. So claps to you. So we also talked about, Leah, that maybe you could spin out a little bit about what future research looks like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I really wanted to have a smaller sample size of teachers so that I could dig into the analysis and have such an extended narrative analysis as I did. But then afterwards, I was like, oh gosh, there's all these specific groups that I would really love to see, you know, more research in. Specifically, I'd love to see primary school teachers. Everyone in my study was secondary teachers. So I'd love to see if there's differences in, you know, what primary school teachers would come to the table and say. I would love also to see research that explores areas of, you know, greater demand in education on inclusive practices. So for example, or that need more resource allocation. So for example, in my district right now, special ed has seen a lot of cuts, and there's a lot of changes and restructuring in our special ed systems to accommodate for budget cuts, which is really sad. I'm laughing, but it's terrible. So I would love to see, you know, a study that focuses on just special ed or just, you know, English language learners, you know, those teachers who really are focused in those areas and what resources they specifically are asking for. And I would also love to see more research on, you know, schools that have effective partnerships with their communities. So in my school district right now, we have one brand new, really beautiful building that's an alternative school, and they have like a teen pregnancy resource program, and they have all of these wonderful collaborations with like healthcare entities. And I would love to see research done on, you know, how effective those are and what they look like when they're in practice. It would be really wonderful to see that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Becky. Great conversation. So the final question for the committee round before we turn to audience questions has to do with this, and you and I have talked about this a lot, Leah, like changing societal expectations of teachers away from the martyr and, you know, the one who's continually giving. What are some things that non-teachers, or like those who are maybe parents or even just community members, like how can we in our everyday discourse and lives, what recommendations would you have for folks on how to start changing the societal archetype of teachers?
Yes. This is definitely, you know, with parents and community, I think this is a conversation that we've seen a couple times, or at least I've seen a couple times in the course of my dissertation work, especially with, you know, when COVID happened and parents were suddenly, you know, at home with their kids, realizing like how much they relied on their teachers. And then we had a month-long strike in my district last year, and parents were upset again. They were like, and so I think I saw a lot of examples of, you know, community realizing just like what it takes to be an educator and to hold space for children. And I think it really, you know, in my conversations with folks that, you know, shared their difficulties in these circumstances, I think the model really just asks people to come with, you know, a mindset of listening and empathy. So listening to teachers when they make demands, whether that's union-based demands for a strike or asks for more community involvement. Just listening is such a huge mindset change. And I feel like I experienced that as a part of this research myself. Like I really came away from each interview with a greater empathy for the teacher's stories and what they experience on a daily basis and what hours they work and what their days look like. And so I know because that process impacted me, that it would impact other people as well. So just continually asking them to listen, asking teachers to be honest and share their stories, about, what this looks like. And to also kind of reframe. I had a friend that I practiced this presentation with, and she was like, well, I felt this way when I was a social worker. I had this sense of like pride, like I'm a martyr. And then she burned out really quickly. So, I think also asking or encouraging teachers themselves to like, it doesn't have to be a badge, martyrship doesn't have to be a badge. Like we're allowed to admit that the work is unsustainable, and that's okay. And that doesn't mean you're a poor teacher. Like just normalizing that part of the conversation for educators and creating spaces in which they feel comfortable to say, this is really hard, I'm falling apart. That's kind of what I do in my job now, since I work with new teachers, like creating a space for them to just say they're struggling.
So glad you're doing that work. Great. Thank you, Leah. You illuminated so much for us. I'd like to open up questions to the folks that we have in the audience with us. Annette.
Let me unmute. Hi, Leah. Thank you so much for this. It's an amazing defense. It's very clear, well organized, very easy to follow. A question or sort of an observation and a question. I have a good friend who was an educator for few decades, and she wound up with burnout along the way many times and went back. And a problem that she faced was having mixed classrooms, where you had students with special education needs alongside those who did not, and the conflict even within the classroom among the students, and how much tension that created. I didn't know if any of the instructors that you interviewed had that experience and how it contributed to their burnout and what they had to say about that.
Yes, it's a huge point of contention, I think, right now. There was no educators in my research that spoke specifically to this issue, but I have seen it, and it's pervasive, and it's hard to know, what the right approach is, because, these teachers care deeply about making sure everybody's needs are met. But how do you do that when structurally it's not working out? So you have, a model that aims for inclusivity. We're going to allow, any student to be able to take any class, but then when the resources aren't directed towards, providing that student the appropriate amount of hours that are recommended in their IEP for one-on-one support time, then you're actually hurting not only the student, but you're placing an additional burden on that teacher's plate. So, how do we mitigate that? And it just, in my experience, they're just like, just deal with it. Like the math, the joke in my district is the math isn't mathing. Like if you actually calculate a special ed's teachers' hours that they're supposed to spend out in classrooms giving individual support time to those students, like the math doesn't math. Like they don't have that many hours in the day to push into those different rooms. So yeah, it's a huge problem. If the math doesn't math, why are we doing it? Why are we doing it?
Right.
We don't have those resources. Why are we hurting everybody involved, not giving that student their support time and burdening people?
And impacting other students who don't need the special ed, but at the same time, the teacher has to take extra time to address the needs of the students in her classroom that need the attention and time. So yeah, it was contentious all the way around.
It is.
Thank you.
Great question. Great response, Leah. B.
Thank you, Alka. Congratulations, Leah. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to listen to your wonderful presentation about your wonderful and extremely important work. I'm the program coordinator for women's spirituality and a PhD student at CIS, and I cannot miss mentioning that you have completed your dissertation in what, 8 semesters, 9 semesters? You started in spring 2020. So while taking time and, you know, taking years to complete dissertation is also absolutely valid and valuable, I just want to acknowledge and to congratulations on doing a concentrated work and focused work in such a short amount of time. My question to you is about, actually, I have a quick observation, which is about the use of word equity and equality. Not just use, but the conceptual implications of those two. I come from a human rights background, and some other audience members come from the same background. And for me, it was always, when I worked on human rights and education, it was also always about equal access to quality education. And now it's all about equity, and I'm fairly confused, but that's a larger issue. Yeah, because, you know, basically I believe that equality presupposes equity. There is no equity without equality. We might have equitable needs, but we have equal rights. In any case, let me get off the soapbox. My question to you is about the focus of the transformation and the focus of your theory of change. It seems to me that on a number of occasions, as you were discussing what needs to be done, who can be doing it, the focus gets to be the sphere of control, which is with the district and with the policies and with all those included or involved with the formal structures of laws, policies, and institutions. On the other hand, you brought up a number of examples of liberation and transformation, mutual aid, creativity, etc. If you were to look at the frame of transformation, how do you see control versus or in light of liberation? Where do you see that the primary and focused point of engagement should be? Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. It's frustrating because I think, you know, the larger the entity, it's almost like the less accountable they're held sometimes for their actions. And oftentimes they also, yeah, they hold the most control, and then that accountability, you know, instead of falling then on them, it falls on the individual teachers themselves for, you know, somehow not magically like making it happen. Like one example I'm thinking of is this teacher who described that her school lost funding for being a English language learner magnet school. So it lost the funding that supported what are they called? Instructional specialists that, you know, oversaw groups of students that were newcomers sometimes to the country. And then they just, you know, put them into classrooms. And then what they did was they labeled the school an international school, but without giving any extra funding. They were just like, we're an international school. And it gives a lot of, it makes the district look really good. But what one of the educators said was every time that she would try to do something that aligned with the international school's model of opportunity for students, she said it was like a door that led to nowhere, because every time she would ask for something, every time she would suggest something, every time she had a great new idea, it was like she would just be told no. Like, we don't have the resources, we don't have the funding, we don't have the support. And then it just reflects badly on her because every attempt she made is being turned down. So yeah, I think that crux is a really difficult one to address, you know, especially because teachers don't necessarily have that level of control. And it's, you know, dehumanizing to be told, we are an equity-focused district, we are an international school, but you don't have any resources to enact it. And it's not really in your hands. The control is not in your hands. It's really challenging.
Thank you for zeroing in on accountability and trust right away. Certainly, you know, much more to be discussed, but congratulations again and thank you.
Other audience members, if it's not a question, you can also share a comment or introduce yourself. Anything before the committee convenes? Amanda Roma.
Thank you, Leah. Congratulations. What a fabulous presentation. I really admire the work that you're doing. And given that it's about leading with love, I'm interested in hearing more about how you extended that to yourself, how you resourced yourself throughout the research process. I heard you say that some of those stories were really difficult to hear and that you took time to record your own responses and integrate what you were hearing from participants. So interested in hearing what kinds of care and resource you extended to yourself during the process, and how now are you incorporating your learnings in your own work supporting educators and modeling maybe some of the practices and resourcing that you've drawn conclusions about.
Oh, that's such a meta question. I love that. Thank you. Well, first of all, I quit teaching. So I felt the privilege of, having, I wonder about how it would have felt to do this research process while still being a classroom teacher. I'm going to think about that now. So I feel like in terms of emotional capacity, I did carve out this space in my life to do, to have a little bit more room to be spacious and not have to carry, the stories of 150 students. My caseload is adults now, and it's much smaller. It's a small group of new teachers. So there's that. But yeah, I think Dr. Thompson really, she spoke to me before I started my interviews and really talked to me a lot about process notes and how important it was to have those. And that really helped me in this process. I sometimes would leave interviews just like, oh, and instead of like diving into it or doing the transcripts right away, I would just write down my thoughts and my feelings and just kind of like remove those from my head through that journaling process. And it also really helped me separate what my immediate reactions were from, what I was actually seeing in the analysis. So I kept those separate a lot of the time, and it helped me really compartmentalize. So that was incredibly helpful.
Great, meta question and response. So any final questions, comments? Dana?
Well, that was just beautiful, and I really enjoyed all of the dialogue around it. I'm a PhD student in the EWP psychology department, and I get a tremendous amount about from watching these dissertations, defenses. And I think it's been addressed already. So I'm wondering, who initiates the dialogues for change? Which groups? There's so many groups, the parents, the administration, the teachers, the community. Where does the initiation of the dialogue begin? Thank you.
That's such a good question. I'm thinking of a circle. There's no end, there's no beginning. I see a lot in my years following being a classroom teacher. I follow a lot of teachers or former classroom teachers who model and normalize sort of the mindset that I'm advocating for here. But what I want to say is that, yeah, it's very risky to do so. So some of these folks, for example, are on social media, and they're sort of, put like fueling the dialogue and conversation around, it's okay to not work outside of your contract hours. It's okay to set limits so that you have more time to spend with your friends and family. It's okay to create in-time class for students to get help rather than staying for hours after school to do it. And unfortunately, I think those teachers are also susceptible to a lot of pushback from the community. Like some of the comments they get are so ugly and cruel, like if you wanted to be a teacher, why be so uncaring? Things like that. So I think, the conversation needs to start everywhere. It needs to start everywhere. Like it needs to be, suffused in our communities as well, so that people can stick up for and support, teachers that have sort of had it and are ready to set boundaries and limits about what they're willing to give. And, it's like with any activist work, we need allies. I think teachers need allies to help them as they continue to stick up for themselves in this work. And, they also need administrators and teacher leaders who share that same value and advocate for it as well. That's such a good question. Thank you.
Glad to have you here from EWP, and I'm glad you asked that question because it did illuminate, it gave Leah you a chance to talk about the negativity that some of these teachers were receiving from people when they were setting boundaries, which speaks to the need for changing the archetype, right? And like changing how we as a society talk about teachers. So thank you for that. Well, that concludes the Q&A, although you are welcome to chat more as a group while the committee goes into a separate room for just 5 to 10 minutes. So, those of you who are here, you can chat, you can take a break, whatever you need to do. And so V, are you gonna create a separate room? Yeah.
Yes, everybody stays put and committee goes away. And that's it. They are there. Let me see what's going on here. Oh, okay, Sundari just went there. Very good. I'll stop recording for a second so that we can.
Congratulations, Dr. Baker. You've passed with flying colors.
Woohoo!
We are all so pleased with your work and your defense and just how great it's been working with you. So a hearty congratulations to you.
I can also say about the doctor part, when I got to do that, just knowing that for the rest of my life I will be a doctor, I just loved that feeling that this is something that I'll always have, and I hope you can feel that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I just said in the breakout room, it's well earned.
Yeah. Professor Baker.
So Dr. Baker, what are you going to do to celebrate tonight, this weekend, coming up?
Oh my gosh, I just want to go to sleep. But I'm going to see live music tonight. So there's a Ukrainian band that's playing and I'm going to go see them.
Great. Sleep is a great celebration. Rest, right? Rest. We should have a book, Rest is Celebration. How about that?
Yeah, you earned that too.
Yeah.
All right.
Also give some a shout out too. I have been on some committees where the person working on it has really been left alone in some key ways, and as an outside person, it's hard for me to navigate around that and to see that loneliness and that abandonment. And in this case, in this instance, it was just such a pleasure to know that that you had a backbone right there with you all the time. Yeah, so as an outside person, I want to praise that process. Professor Aurora.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate how much you put in as an external reader. you know, I feel like you went above and beyond in many ways. So thank you for that. So folks can feel free to unmute, to say bye, congratulations, and then we'll wrap up.
Congratulations again, Leah.
Dr. Baker.
Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Dr. Baker, congratulations again, Dr. Baker. I'm so happy that I can go around saying, and then we had a student who did it in 4.5 years. Even though, again, 10 years is fine, but then we had a student who did it in 4.5 years. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It means a lot that you all showed up to support me in this process. So thank you for taking the time out of your day.
And Leah, I was looking at the chat here. It said, do you want to put your email address, or did you already send that to?
Oh, yes, I will put my email in here. Yeah, Dana had asked for my interview questions, and the chat was like, you can't fit these into the text box. But I did have a file that I sent to the participants before the interviews so that they could look at the questions ahead of time, and I'll just send that file after I find it. So there's my email, Dana. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know because it's LM Baker.
Mm-hmm.
Baker. Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for being here. Really appreciate it. And get some good rest and enjoy your live music, Dr. Baker.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Congratulations, Dr. Baker. Bye-bye.
Congratulations again. Bye.